Hey podcaster, have you ever thought about the type of audiences that are listening to your show? If you've started your show or you've been podcasting for a while, your audience is kind of the person that you're creating content for, right? But have you taken the time to think about the type of audiences that you may have? Well, in this episode, I'm going to cover a few things that you need to consider. This is going to be a super actionable episode because I want you to have this awareness so that in the next episode that you create, you craft content that is going to help you long-term convert new listeners and also obviously have a bigger impact. All right, let's tackle this topic because I think it's going to make a huge difference in your podcast journey. I'm Anna Xavier, and this is the Podcast Space. All right, podcasters, so let's tackle these 3 types of audiences that you have on your podcast and you never thought about. Number 1 is your current audience. These are the people who listen to your show, and they kind of can be included in 2 separate categories, the occasional listener and the superfan. The occasional listener is someone who may follow your podcast, may follow you on social media, but they don't listen to every single episode. They will consume your content depending on the titles, for instance, or the topics that you pick. Maybe they only listen to your solo episodes and don't listen to the guest interviews because let's say they don't have enough time, or they are people who will just listen to the interviews because they prefer it like that, you know? And then there's your superfans. The superfans are people who will listen to every single episode. They love your content, they love your brand, and whatever you release, they will consume it. Like nothing you can do is ever wrong. So these are people who will share your podcast episodes with friends and family. These are people who are very likely to help you get new listeners. And so those 2 types of people are that first section that I was talking about. And then we have your potential listeners. And these are 2 types of people. You have your guests. These are people that have been either in your network or are new to your network, but they could become a listener, right? These are people who have been on your show to get to know you. They get to know your brand, and they suddenly may be converted from a guest to a listener. And then you have your window shoppers, which are people who, they may be part of your network. They are in your community. They may like all of your posts. They, for a reason or another, they may never have listened to podcast episodes. Maybe it's someone you work with 20 years ago or 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and they're not necessarily within your same industry. And they may be people who have never listened to a podcast ever. And so they have the potential to be your podcast listeners, but they need like that extra incentive in order for them to convert from your connection to a podcast listener, right? So you have to talk about something specific that they love, they are really interested. Maybe you're talking about like a past work experience that they may have been a part of, and that's the reason why they listen. But it doesn't mean that they will never become listeners. It's just like highly unlikely. And then obviously the people who have been on your social media. I think it's important to say this because I don't think enough people talk about this. And that is that not everyone that is in your social media or your email newsletter or your website will become a podcast listener. And I think this is very, very important to bear in mind and not feel frustrated that you can convert your subscribers or social media people into podcast listeners. Remember that what I teach you here on this podcast is to use your podcast as a tool for your business and your online brand, and not necessarily to just look at it as the final product that you have to get everyone to get there. You want to use your podcast as just another way to get information. Like for instance, I never expect my community in my newsletter to become a listener of the show. I know that I'm giving them value on the newsletter, so maybe they are busy people who will never have the time to squeeze in another podcast, but I know that at some point they may recommend my podcast to someone else because they just know that I deliver a lot of good value on my newsletter already. So there's hope to be kept, but I will also share the truth that, I should check. And I'm going to actually check right now in real time with you. So at the time of this recording, let's go and see. I am following nearly 500 people. I would never be able to listen to 500 podcasters, right? Even if their show is just once a month, I don't think I would be able to do it. And so I want you to bear in mind that, these people are still part of your community, and you don't need to look at them as kind of like these people who are annoying and never become podcast listeners, because overall your podcast is just one of the many things that you're doing in order to get people excited about your brand or transform their life, right? So that's the thing that I want to keep in mind. That's pretty much the most actionable thing that I want you to remember, is that don't feel discouraged if people like your posts, but they just actually never listen to the podcast. This is going to be a shocker for most people in the industry. This lady who is talking about how maybe it's not that bad that not everyone converts into a listener. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the new listeners. These are people who are just new to your brand. And these people are someone who maybe have just started following you. Maybe they were a product of someone else recommending your show to them. But the thing that I want you to keep in mind is the user journey. A lot of times when I'm listening to podcasts, the host will not have an intro, not have a lot of things that are important. So maybe they don't have a teaser to explain what the content is, and maybe they don't have anything relevant enough or educational enough on the podcast page, or they don't have a website. And so for these new listeners, I want you to think about what is the experience of someone who is just new to you. I want you to consider, do you have a podcast trailer? Something that your listeners can play before listening to an episode. And this can be anything from like a minute 30 to 5 minutes to 8 minutes, right? Something really quick and easy that just gives an overview of what these podcasts is about and what they're going to get out of it, right? So that's my actionable tip for you. What is the listener journey when they are just getting into your podcast? Do they have links back to your social media to connect with you there, or links to your website? What are they going to do right once they started listening to your content? What is the call to action? I want you to consider all of these things, because all in all, it's important for you to consider every single person who may be getting in contact with your podcast. And so I feel like on the next episode, you can think about all of these things that I talked about, or just do a very quick audit of your podcast situation and what you need to be doing in order to make sure that you convert any kind of people perusing around your profile into new followers, new listeners, all of that good thing. So if you've been enjoying this show, please make sure that you subscribe. We're available on YouTube and all podcast platforms, obviously, and also at thepodcastspace.com. You can find the podcast over there and connect with me on all social media, especially Instagram. That's the one place that I love the most, at the podcast space. All right, you have a wonderful week and continue creating imperfect content that drives you forward. Bye.